Ladies and gentlemen, All Variations Aeropod. I have a series of projects coming up which are going to require some historical costuming. And the first one, even though it's going to be a project of extreme compromise in terms of its historical accuracy, is also going to cover the largest span of history. Well, I say history, it's more prehistory, because to begin with we're going to go for the Neolithic era. Now this first costume is going to cover the period from the construction of Göbekli Tepe, about 12,000 BCE, to the founding of the first cities in about 5,000 BCE. So it's quite a large span of time, and to begin with, really I should have split this up into two areas. The first being around about the time of the founding of Göbekli Tepe, which is primarily done by hunter-gatherer peoples. There's very little settlements, and there's a bit of a debate as to whether it was the beginning of farming and permanent settlement that led to Göbekli Tepe, or whether it was Göbekli Tepe and that monumental construction that led to farming. I tend to think it's the latter, but I'm not an archaeologist or a historian, I don't know. So the first thing I should say, and the first thing we're going to have to really compromise on, is going to be the materials used. In that early period especially, there would have been a lot of fur used. Fur and ethically sourced leather in general is something that's really expensive to acquire, and especially with fur, it's almost impossible to get ethically. And while I do have some leather like this, which I could use in some areas of the build, it's not really very useful for clothing. It's a bit too thick. This I brought for belts and bags and things, so it's not really useful for making, say, a tunic, as would have been worn at the time. When it comes to the furs, we've got another problem in that basically you can't get it ethically. So that leaves us with fake furs, but fake furs are plastic, and I don't like working with plastics because they just linger in the environment forever. So I've had to come up with a compromise for that. I've gone to a charity shop and picked up a fur coat. It's a fake fur coat, although actually not all fake fur is actually fake fur. Sometimes some unscrupulous sellers will have real fur and sell it as fake fur because they know people will actually buy it if it's listed as fake fur, and they won't if it's real fur. That tends to be on the high end things and are expensive anyway, but they're listed as fake fur. I just generally tend to avoid anything that's fur. This, however, I know is fake fur because you can do the burn test, but I can just see by looking at it, this is fake. And I did intend to buy a lot more furs just to make something a bit more Mesolithic, a little bit more hunter-gatherer, because hunter-gatherers would wear more animal clothing rather than plant fibres, because they're not sitting in one place farming and being able to weave cloth and things like that. So they would be wearing leathers and furs almost exclusively, very small amount of plant fibre. The more settled farmers are likely to wear more plant fibres. So what I was going to do for the hunter-gatherers, buy more of this fur, it's almost impossible to get this in any great quantity. Or through all the charity shops I went to, the majority of the jackets and coats and hats and things like that, they've just got a small band of fake fur around them. This is one of the few full fur coats, and the ones that I could find tended to be on the more expensive side, even though they're from a charity shop. This one was £15, not too bad, and I've got a full coat of fur. So I'm going to use that in the construction, but because this is going to be a Neolithic build, or New Stone Age, when people are more settled and farming, I'm going to say that the fur is going to be more of a status and fashion accessory than it is just general clothing. So I've got some fur in order to create, I'm thinking of making a mantle for the costume. The majority of the costume is going to be based on linen. Now linen would have been the primary material for fabric construction early on, because you don't need to do very much in order to get the flax plant to become linen. Basically the majority of the fibres are already there, you've just got to do a bit of drying, beating, processing, and then you can weave. Cotton, on the other hand, you've got to take out all the seeds, you've got to have an enormous amount of cotton plants, which require a lot of effort and tending in order to get cotton in any great quantity. Flax, on the other hand, a lot easier to get, and this is a lovely linen, very soft and very pliable. I think theirs originally in the Mesolithic would have been a lot more rugged. They wouldn't have been able to process it as well as I think we can. But in terms of ancient fabrics, this is probably the first type of fabric that people would have had, linen fabric. When it comes to the sewing techniques, however, although historic sewing tends to be something of a niche thing, especially here on YouTube, with people fascinated by historic sewing techniques, there is no reason to think that any of the sewing techniques that were around, say, in the medieval period, wouldn't have also been available to people in the Neolithic, because sewing and needlework predates the Neolithic by a long way. The first needles we found created by shards of bone are from thousands of years before farming. We were in, I think it's the Mesolithic we first find needles, and they were able to get them very small, not quite as small as our metal needles, but very tiny. So we tend to think of people in the past, especially the distant past, as being very primitive and not being able to do very much, being kind of stupid. As a matter of fact, if you were to take a human out of the Stone Age and bring them to modern times as a child and start raising them as a child today, they'd have no problem fitting in and adapting. There's nothing in that person which would preclude them from being as intelligent and as skillful as we are with everything. And if you add into the fact that these people would have been sewing handmade clothes for their entire lives, you can bet they're going to work out quicker ways and easier ways of doing things. So any sewing technique I think that would have been available to people in the Middle Ages would probably have also been available to people in the Stone Age, with the possible exception of some fine needlepoint embroidery, which requires very tiny needles. Basically, if you can do it with a bone needle, they were able to do it. Any type of knot that we can tie, they could tie. You know, unless they needed specialist equipment, the chances are they're going to be able to do it, and probably better than us, because they would have been much more practiced at it. To begin with, I've got this natural colour linen fabric, and what I'm going to do is create a tunic out of it. Tunic is the simplest design. As I've just gone through saying that anything that we could do in the Middle Ages, Stone Age people would probably be able to do. There are a few exceptions. They wouldn't have had patterns because they didn't have any system of writing. They didn't have any paper or anything like that. So the chances are the only patterns they would have been able to have is what they could draw in the dirt with a stick, and then it just gets washed away. So the chances are they've got no patterns. They're basically working from their own creativity, what can be passed down by word of mouth. So the clothing initially is going to be simple. There's not going to be loads of complex parts to it. So what I'm going to do with this is do a simple tunic where we take this is 2 meters of fabric, folded in half, head hole cut in, and then sewn down the sides with armholes left open. However, whilst I will say that I'm trying to create it as simply as possible, I just create a tunic, which seems to be what people did wear in ancient times, even in recorded history, very simple clothing like that. Even after this period in recorded history that we have, we know that people say the ancient Egyptians and Sumerians were just wrapping themselves in a single sheet of fabric. So, you know, the clothing at the time would have been simple. One thing I will say is that if you're making something like a tunic and you're doing it for your entire life, you're not going to do it that many times before you start going, what else could I do to make this a little bit more fun, to add some style to it, because that's what humans do, we like to create art. So I reckon, this is just no evidence for this is just me thinking what would people have done at the time. I think it's highly likely that to begin with, they probably would have been putting paint on this. So if a woman had made herself, say, a tunic and she had had children, I could easily imagine at some point just having her children make handprints across the front of the tunic around the stomach area, just because, you know, she gave birth to them, they're her children, and it would just be like decoration around the side. And we know people were putting handprints on caves long before this period, so I can easily see them doing things like that. We'd have no evidence for it because fabric just doesn't survive from this period. A lot of, when you look on YouTube and you say people show examples of Stone Age clothing, things like Utsi the Iceman, not actually Stone Age. It's from the Chalcolithic, which is when it's Copper Age. We haven't discovered bronze yet, but we've got copper. We don't really have any fabric from the Stone Age. The oldest we have, I think, is about 3,500 BC, which is in ancient Egypt, long after the Neolithic has ended. So we don't have any direct evidence of any clothing from this period, so we don't know how they decorated it. What I'm going to do with this, rather than paint it up, and because I don't have any evidence of that, one thing I'm pretty certain they would have been able to do is make it more tailored, form fit it. But enough blathering on, let's get to actually sewing. Okay, 2 meters of fabric folded directly in half, so it will come down to about knee level, which is quite good. And if I place that at one end, which means that the other side should come to about there. So let's mark that on with a pin. So that's going to be about the distance of the tunic. It's going to come down to about there. Just got to cut a head hole in it. Right, so let's mark that out. The first step in tailoring from draping is to just pin up the side so that it seals up. Now I didn't fold this in half particularly accurately, but what you will notice is one side will be longer than the other, simply because humans are a different shape on the front than the back. And now in the next stage we need to move the pins in closer so that it fits closer to the curve of the body. Although this is the easiest way to tailor things without patterns, it is very difficult to do on your own, so if you've got an extra pair of hands around, be sure to use them. And once everything's pinned, but before we try sewing it, we've got to try taking off the item of clothing and putting it back on again without stabbing ourselves with the pins too much, which is easier said than done. I decided to draw on with chalk where I want the seam line to be, marking where the pins were because they're liable to fall out. To sew this together, I'm going to balance out the strength of the stitch with the speed of the stitch by doing a running back stitch. That's where I do a running stitch for several lengths of the stitch and then go back a few stitches and do the same again, so that we double up on some areas but we still get the speed of doing a running stitch along the side. Once everything's sewn up, I'm going to turn it inside out so the seam's hidden and then try it on again. It's a bit of a tight fit over my clothes, but it works. And with that, we're basically done. I've just got to hem up the edges and cut off that excess at the bottom there. All very simple stuff that you don't need to see me do. And because I'm on a very tight deadline, which is entirely arbitrary and made up by myself, but a deadline nonetheless, I want to move on to this and get something nice and warm to wear as part of this costume. You see, the costume itself is supposed to be for someone who lives around the region of Göbekli Tepe, which is in Turkey, so it's going to be fairly warm through most of the year, but in the winter, especially in the highlands, it gets quite cold. And I want to include some fur just as like a fashion statement for somebody who would have lived at the time. Not strictly necessary, but you know, it's a trophy of a hunt. So I've been racking my brains on exactly how I'm going to turn this into something that looks at least vaguely Stone Age. So I'm going to have to do something with it to make it look more time appropriate, less anachronistic. So obviously my first thought was collar's got to go, cut off the sleeves, have it as some sort of like, what do you call them, jenkin, something like that. You know, a jacket without the sleeves, a vest sort of top. But I thought that's still going to look fairly modern. It's not going to look right for Stone Age. So, and I was thinking, what if we wore it slightly different? What if, rather than, you know, wearing it over the shoulders, we tied it around so it was like a sash, so you have it at one end at the top there, put that bit under the arm, try not to make too much noise on my mic, and wrap that around the side, join it in the centre, and sort of have a wraparound fur structure, just like a mantle. That was a possibility, but there's not that much material there, and to get to go all the way around, especially with the chest in the way, you'd be putting things quite tight, and then it's how do you attach it, take it off. There's not metal for brooches, so you'd have to make it out of bone and leather strap, so it's complicated. But then I came up with something that I've actually been wearing whilst at work, because I'm working from home, I can do, where I've got actually put the safety pin in. Actually, let's take the mic out. Hopefully you can still hear me in that. So what I did was place the jacket over me upside down, use this safety pin, which is hard to get exactly lined up, and that seems like it's a decent sort of mantle cover. I'm gonna have to take off the sleeves and the collar anyway, but that to me looks quite alright, and it's fairly warm, so I have been wearing it whilst working from home, just because I don't notice how warm it is until I take it off, and then I get the cold breeze across my shoulders and I'll put that back on. So that's what I'm going to do with it. Let's take it back off again so I can actually work with it and put my mic on properly. So I've got to work out a way of attaching those two sides together, and I'm probably going to do that with a leather strap rather than trying to create any kind of brooch out of stone and bone and wood, because I'm not going to have time to do that. Sleeves have got to be removed, which will leave holes, which isn't actually that bad a thing, because you could think this would be an animal skin in the actual Neolithic. So the animal's going to have legs. Where are the legs going to be? Where's the spear going to have gone through to kill it? So there are going to be holes in the fur anyway. So I'll just say that that's sort of where the leg hole is. And this is like half an animal. The other half's been used to make clothes for, say, children or something. This is the remainder that should have been used for making a sort of, it's a shawl really, isn't it? But what I am going to do with the tying across, I'm going to get some, I've got some leather cord. I used it previously on my race guy walkabout, which video link should be popping up somewhere at the top, not certain which side. I'm going to use that just to tie a cord across the front, something that can keep it fastened. First things first, let's get the proper shape by taking the parts off that I don't need. Right, so this is the bottom of the jacket, and I've marked on the two areas I want them attached together in order to get the correct length with these big safety pins. And if this was leather, what I'd do is I'd poke through with an awl. If it's Stone Age, it'd be a flint awl, and make some holes that I could then feed either some sinew or strip of leather cord in order to create lacing that could tie the two sides together. Now I do have an awl, and I did buy this bone needle, hoping that maybe I might be able to just squeeze it through without tearing too much of the fabric on the inside of this fur, I mean. But unfortunately, as I try and push this through, there's no way of me getting it through without breaking at least one thread, which can start causing shedding with the fake fur on top. Going to be difficult to actually sew with this, but I'm going to try and give it a go. I'm going to use this instead of the awl, and I'm going to try and poke through on each of these and then feed through this leather cord in order to create some lacing. So where these are, you see the stripes in the fabric, so I'm going to try and match up the stripes. So I'm going to poke one through here. Let's try lacing bone needle as well. There we are. And then try and match that up on the other side. So thread through there as well. Now I want two more holes, probably underneath. So I'm going to go, let's use this, some imperial measures, but let's go an inch underneath. poke another hole through. And same on the other side, 1 inch below. Now I apologise for the sound in the next bit, but sewing Bridget was an idiot and didn't take off her mic. So the way I'm going to tie this up, as you can see, I've laced across one side to the other, and then I've got the two holes 1 inch further down. That's 2.5 centimetres for people who live in the civilised world. The way I'm going to tie these on, I'm going to remove these safety pins I used to stop it falling through. Right, so the way we're going to tie it is going to take one end, just do an ordinary knot, and any knot that we can do, they should be able to do. They have the same brain, the same hands, the same materials. So any knot that I can do here, they would also have been able to do back in the Stone Age. On this side, I'm going to tie a similar knot on here, which is the same as your shoelace, just like wrap it round, tuck it through. I'm doing your shoelaces but without the bow, basically. So we've got 2 knots on there, and then these 2 can just slide around. Alright, so I need to cut that bit off and get it down to size, but with those 2 knots there, that means I can open it out and pull it tighter as I need to. So it's laced up at the front, and I can just slide it off over my head. Got a nice shawl. All I've got to do now is seal up those holes at the back and disguise the collar a bit. In disguising the collar and sealing up the holes where I've removed the sleeves, I'm just going to do a simple whip stitch, which is where you pass the needle through one side, put it straight through, and then into the other side, and then go back to the first one just so it goes round and around and around. Simple stitch, would have been used at the time. And there we have it, a rather chic Stone Age costume. Now what you see me doing here is just testing out how active I can be within it, because if you're going to wear it in the Stone Age, you need to be able to run around and escape saber-tooth tigers and whatnot. So here I'm dropping things, picking things up, running, jumping. A few things to note is that firstly the shawl will side back if I reach up too high with both arms, so I'm probably going to need some sort of strap underneath the arms in order to stop it from doing that. Even though I did finish the other hems, I've decided to leave the collar raw, just because it was starting to look too modern once I started hemming things up. And this is supposed to be a costume, and it is supposed to be evocative of the Stone Age.